Did everyone get that and have a chance to read it? And that covered freedom of information, talking amongst each other, some of the things we need to do. Other than that, I will turn it over to Director Brown.
I have a question too, Dave,
Sure.
on this. When I first got involved, we were the Planning and Zoning Commission, and then we say, well, we're just the Planning Commission, and then we've got the bylaws, and I don't care. I mean, but I just
Sure.
do we need to
We are
straighten that out?
well, it's never changed.
Okay, go ahead.
We have always been the Planning and Zoning Commission. That's by state statute.
Oh,
It's just that you will hear me and others foreshorten it to Planning Commission because it's easier. And I figure you know that you're technically the Planning and Zoning
oh,
Commission.
so, okay.
Okay, does that make sense?
No official change. Okay, thank you.
Okay. You should have a copy, speaking of planning and zoning, of the actual bylaws of your group. And when you have time, it's worth reading through here. There's nothing eye-shattering, but it does set out useful things like every beginning of each year you elect chair and vice chair and so on, and how you operate, and if you don't actually show up, the county commissioners can let you go, and that sort of thing. So it's a quick read worth spending a minute or two on, just to remind yourselves of how you operate. And the basis for you as an organization, you should know, can be found in state statutes. There's kind of two places in the state statutes to look. If you want, I'll email you all of you. I think most all of you have this already. But for our new member, I'll just mention the Title 67, Chapter 65 sets out that there shall be a Planning and Zoning Commission, either depending on whether it's a city or a county. The commissioners or council appoint the Planning Commission. To me, the interesting part is the state law goes on to say how the membership is apportioned. And it all has to do with representation from the unincorporated county, the cities, and so on and so forth. So the board's a little bit hamstrung when it comes to appointing vacancies. It has to meet state statute. Similarly, under Title 67, Chapter 65, there's a whole express series of things that say what the Plan Commission must do. And most important in all of that is it's ultimately the Plan Commission that's responsible for doing the comprehensive plan. What's a itty bit unusual in my experience in Idaho from other states is that it sets it out as the Plan Commission must, and then it says all the things that must be covered, but it doesn't say how frequently or often it should be redone. So I just periodically push, and the commissioners have agreed that every 5-10 years we should take a look at things, see how things are going, or adjust according to how the population is growing and so on. Because I'll borrow from the phrase I learned 40 years ago from a planner in Texas that did comprehensive planning for a living. He said you should think of land use planning and comprehensive plans as like skeet shooting. You have to continually adjust the aim in order to hit the mark. So to me, you should be constantly aware, and now if we reframe that this way, planners, my staff and I, and the Planning Commission, I'll be so bold as to say, should have the ear to the ground and know the politics and the economics of your community better than anyone. Because that's how you know we should be adjusting the comprehensive plan and making changes. That's my editorial for today.
And we're working with the 2020 now, so you're working on a 2025.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
Good segue.
Right. Yeah. All right.
But I should, before we go much further, I should mention one more thing. We'll just take another minute or two, and then we can move on unless anyone has questions. But today's workshop, you should think of as an informal meeting, meaning we can dialogue as if we're at home around the coffee table. There should be no expectation from the public that they have the ability to talk at these things, except and unless, as the chair allows. Because the whole idea of a workshop is that we are discussing what needs to be done and what we are doing and so on, and we ought to be able to do that in a free-flowing exchange of ideas and dialogue. Well, if you'll contrast that for a moment with public hearings, which our planning commission doesn't do so much, and I'll sidestep for a moment and explain why later. But the reason why hearings are different is that then you're acting as a legislative body to review typically a staff proposal for either a code amendment or a comprehensive plan update or just changes. And so the distinction I want you to take away is, as a legislative body, you're operating just like the state legislature does, where you can talk to your constituents ahead of time, and you can have unlimited dialogue with anyone and everyone about what's before us, because it's a legislative matter. That's very different from a quasi-judicial matter, which our hearing examiners and Board of County Commissioners have, and most planning commissions around the country have. So if you're out in other parts of the country visiting, you talk to your cohorts there, you'll hear they typically are hearing the cases that our hearing examiner hears, which are the land use cases that require, say, a variance or a rezoning or a subdivision, all things that by code go to a public hearing, usually with a plan commission first, then the plan commission recommends to the Board of County Commissioners or City Council, whichever applies. So the key takeaway there is that, in a way, you're kind of lucky. You get to deal with policy matters almost exclusively. You don't deal with any of the hearings that our hearing examiner in Idaho has taken over. And so that makes it easier for us to stay focused on comprehensive planning code updates. I will tell you, in most of my life, I've worked in places like Colorado, Texas, where we would start at noon and go till 9 or 10 at night, because we had both quasi-judicial and judicial or legislative matters. It was tiresome. And you had a plan commission with a backbone of steel to be able to deal with that on a monthly or every 2-week basis. So just a different animal, just so you know. That's really all I can think of, unless you have questions.
Yeah, anyone have questions?
Well, thank you. And we can move
We'll
on.
move on. The next item is the election of chair and vice chair. And I think, as I told you in the email that I sent out, this is my last year. So we need to be looking at new leadership, bringing along new leadership. And so,
Madam Chair,
yes.
may I nominate a slate? I'd like to nominate Madeline David for chair and Tamara Basin for vice chair.
Okay.
Do I second that? Or is that a secondable?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
I second that.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. And my commitment will be to work with Tamara to bring her into this role. And
Yeah, I was wondering about that, other organizations I work with, you kind of have a chairman-elect or a president-elect that works with the current, so that you get, yeah. Just,
We don't have that formally.
but I mean,
but
yeah,
it
but
has
what
worked
I'm
informally.
talking about is making it kind of an informal
Oh.
process,
Yeah.
yeah, so.
And that's the way it's worked so far.
Has it? Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
And that's why Madeline brought it up that way.
right. Okay. Who was the second on that?
Me.
Okay. turn this over to whoever's going to go with the setback overlay zone.
That would be, I'll set the stage and then Ben can talk about the details. We have had lots of variances in certain parts of the county in the 11 years I've been here, and from what I can tell, lots of years before that. And both good planning practice, you read about it in planning textbooks, but also the courts of our land have said, because a lot of these things get adjudicated, that when you start to see repetitive requests for variances in the same area, you should consider whether your zoning is right and whether you ought to do amendments to the zoning. So frankly, we are long overdue for some amendments to our zoning requirements, mostly along the lakes. And what's going on there is along the lakes we have our most dense zoning, restricted residential, which allows for small lots as small as 8,250 square feet. And we get monstrous size houses, and we have houses that predate the development and building code, but we also have subdivisions that date back to the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, which was long before we had code. So when you put all those things together, they conspire to make for circumstances that really requires more special zoning than the sort of blanket zoning we did in the 70s. You know, the zoning we have in effect today along the lakes is the same setback requirements we've had since 1973. So that's why I say it's long overdue to look at what amounts to a rezoning, but we're going to do it as an overlay zone. And the reason we're looking at it as an overlay zone is it's just easier to come in and find parts of the county, create setbacks that work expressly for those parts, and then create an overlay for that area. That way you don't have to deal with the problem of categorical zoning, where our category in this case is restricted residential. If we change the setbacks for all of restricted residential throughout the entire county, that can make things even worse. Because we have parts of the county that aren't right around the lakes, or they don't necessarily need the flexibility that we just talked about. So I hope that gives you the setting for why we need to look at some sort of overlay zone. Does that help you?
Can you give me an example of?
Yes. We have an airport overlay zone right now today. And that's been in place since before I got here. But what it did, and if you go back and read the Land Use Development Code, you'll see there are special zonings just for the airport that make good sense, good practical sense, since FAA and the state, you would know, have certain requirements for the runways that have been in place since the 70s, that you can't exceed certain heights, you can't have stuff too close to the runways, you can't have too close to the airport, it goes on and on. And so it's just easier to do an overlay zone for these special areas that need it than a blanket zone that could affect, or excuse me, blanket rezoning that could in fact emit, there's a Freudian slip, that could be problematic for the entirety of the industrial or light industrial zoning districts, which is what our airport is currently zoned. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. So I hope that's good enough stage setting for Ben to take over and go from there.
Share that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So what David is referring to has caused a number of variance requests that have been public hearings. They go to the Board of County Commissioners eventually for a decision. And what that has essentially done is it's put approximately $4,000, maybe a little bit more, on applicants, as well as a time frame of about 6 months. And so that essentially is necessary to get approved before they can get their building permit issued. And so what we have seen is that a lot of these areas, and I've got an area pulled up, this is Hayden Lake, this is kind of the southwest corner of Hayden Lake, and on the Hayden Lake Road, you'll see that there are a number of these variance icons here, these blue.
Everything that's blue
Text.
is a variance.
So those are all variance requests that we have received, and the board essentially grants them the approval. They've demonstrated that there's uniqueness, in this case it's a slope issue. They don't have the ability to meet the setback requirements and the regulated or the standard setback requirements. And so it's caused them to have to push the structure closer to the road, which does create less disturbance, and it doesn't blow up the hillside. So the board has routinely approved these things, but it's become something of a concern of theirs that these projects, is that if there's any way that we could do some kind of setback overlay where these projects are not coming to them for a decision, but we build them into the code so that a property owner along this area and others have an expectation of some different setbacks that still fall in line with the same standards like geotechnical analysis, because again, these sites are steep. If there's any way that we could pursue something like that, they'd be appreciative of that. So what we have done is kind of looked at some of the areas where we've been getting the most requests for variances, focusing on the Hayden Lake area, and then also kind of the Bayview area. You guys may be familiar with the Bayview area. For different reasons, we've been receiving variance requests in this area too, and this is mostly because of just the lot sizes. The lot sizes are extremely small in this area, and they're approximately, I think, in some cases, maybe 50 feet, maybe less than that. So they're very, very thin, very small lots. Some of them that are not part of this plat, you'll find, like in some of these areas, that they're extremely small. There's just no way that anybody can build on one of these lots and meet setbacks. It's just not possible. The setback requirements traditionally in the restricted residential zone are 25 feet from the front, 25 feet from the rear, and 10 feet on the sides. Well, if we're looking at this lot specifically, and we only have a 60-foot depth of the lot, you take 50 feet out of that, there's just no room to build a 10-foot wide structure. So, so we've kind of been focusing on kind of the Bayview Township area is what we've been calling it. And again, more focusing on the Hayden Lake area. There certainly are other areas within the county that if this is something that the Planning Commission is supportive of and then eventually the board is supportive of, we probably would want to revisit some of these other areas within the county that we still see some variance requests. But let's see here, I do have it up. As you may see here, we've kind of broken these out into these two different areas. What we are kind of wanting to do at the moment is to present, of course, the idea to you, and then maybe look at some guidance or getting some guidance from you as to which, how staff should proceed. There is the ability, when we're looking at the Hayden Lake area, when we're trying to determine what this setback overlay district should look like, it could be something along the lines of a buffer from the ordinary high water mark a certain distance and then call that kind of the setback overlay district. Or we could look at it more site specific and looking at things like the slope data that we have, and then kind of pick those parcels and make those part of the setback overlay district. So there are benefits and challenges to each one, and we can kind of go through some of those if you'd like. But that's kind of what we're wanting to at least get the conversation started with, saying that we see a need for an overlay district for setback purposes, and these are the kind of two areas that we'd like to focus on. So that's kind of an introduction.
Yeah, I have a question on that. I start to think about the amount of work it would take to locate each parcel that you were gonna put the oversight into based upon slope data or whatever. I mean, and I don't know how much you guys have, and I don't know if these areas that you're showing on here have names of the subdivisions or something like that, where you could say, well, this whole subdivision's in the, you know, in the process or whatever. I don't know what you have for that, but some of these older ones, I'm sure the subdivisions aren't even named or anything, are they? I mean, they're just individual parcels that are, you know.
Well, if it's part of a subdivision and there's actually a plat filed with the county.
Okay, all right, so
then it
there is
will
a
be
plat
named.
for everything, okay.
Not,
That's,
well, I'm saying if there is.
If there is,
Yeah.
and that is most of them.
okay, all right.
There's some government town sites and other things,
Yeah.
but for the most part, we can name things. For the most part, everything you described is on our geographic information system.
Is it? Okay.
So
okay.
it's fairly easy to
All right.
locate these areas. I think the main thing we want to get your feeling on is, does this make sense to you? Are we going in the right direction? Do you have any recommendations or suggestions? I'll piggyback on what Ben said and say, in my view, these two areas we picked out are kind of the most problematic, would be good prototypes. If we can get through it and it goes well and we actually see the benefit of it, we would just automatically circle back around and say, here's the next couple that we think makes sense. And all this we really have to do in piecemeal because we don't have a long-range planning division. We have no planners that are designated to do long-range planning. I will tell you, that is highly unusual for a municipality in this country, but that's the way we've operated forever.
So all these areas you're considering, they currently do not have housing, they're empty lots?
Oh no, they mostly do have housing.
Yeah, for instance, I mean, if we go back,
So the variance is because they want to make a bigger house?
Or in some cases, just remodel the one they have because the one they have is non-conforming.
Because it was built prior to,
And under non-conformity laws, you can repair, remodel what you have, but you can't expand. So you can't even pop the top.
yeah, I mean, there's certainly a mix. I mean,
Yeah.
especially with some of the steeper sites, it's often that those ones are built last. And so you have development that are, I mean, this subdivision, for instance, Hayden Lake, Honeysuckle Hills building sites, that's a plat from the 40s. And so there are a lot of parcels that are developed within that because they've been around for a while. But
It
there
costs a fortune to build on these vacant ones.
But there are a number of them still that are undeveloped, yeah. And so, yeah, so they could be certainly a mix.
So most of this would be for rebuilding homes, not building new ones?
Well, it'd be both.
Both.
The overlay would apply to all development, all new development in the area of the overlay.
so the overlay allows them to go ahead and do this without coming and asking for a
That's the issue.
variance.
Yes.
So that's the benefit. What is the downside? What is the potential downside?
I don't think there is one. Again, as when I started off, the courts and good planning practice have said for at least the 40 years that I've been doing this, that in this sort of circumstance, you should rezone. We've just taken the overlay approach because we think it's smarter.
I would say that perhaps if there is a downside, if there is an overlay district, the public will not have an opportunity to speak before a decision maker as far as like a public hearing setting. But again, I mean, in the second page of that document, you'll see kind of the drafted setback proposal.
The only other thing that, of course, having been in enforcement for so many years, say someone wanted to build something in Hayden and they know that, say, its front yard's 10 feet, okay. I don't know if we're equipped to make sure that they don't do it at 7 feet. See, that's, in other words, what is the teeth that we have to make sure that if you have an overlay, that it's abided by, I guess is what I'm talking about, so.
It gets reviewed the same way we review things now.
If it was
For record,
permitted,
is it?
yeah, okay.
Well, every time a building permit comes in, the staff looks at it and looks at the current zoning.
Sure.
to see the new setback. And in this case, if there were an overlay, they'd look at the overlay.
But would they still come in for a building permit then?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right,
Yeah, it
so
doesn't
that's,
change-
that's what I'm
Doesn't
talking
change
about.
building permit
Yeah,
at all.
okay, all right, doesn't affect the building permit process at all? Okay, okay.
Yeah, and-
So
and
that's
it-
your enforcement process? Okay,
Absolutely, yes.
Good, okay.
So, just so I can get a feel for the difference, okay, so the overlay would be 10 feet, what was it before?
20, the front yard?
Yeah,
Could you just actually go through the whole list? I was gonna ask the same thing.
yeah.
Yeah, so for the restricted residential zone, which both of these areas would apply to, it is 25 feet currently, 25 feet from the front, 10 feet from the sides, and 25 feet from the rear.
And I'm assuming that because you've received a lot of variances, that it wouldn't be a situation where their neighbor is saying, whoa, wait a minute, you're getting a little too close, we're getting a little too dense here.
I can answer that. Piggybacking on what Ben said, any overlay zone we come up with not only comes to you as a workshop, but also a public hearing at your level, and then another public hearing at the county commissioner level.
Okay,
And
so
in
people
which
would have a
case,
chance
every
to,
person in the
Yes.
neighborhood and all the county knows we're considering it.
okay,
So that's the time we should get that feedback.
okay.
So are you routinely granting these?
Yeah, routine's a good way to say it.
And these new figures, how were they established?
They were basically formed from the requests that we received from different variances in this area.
Pretty,
So
Yeah.
this would, it's fair to say, if this were approved, it would obviate all the variances we've had.
Yeah, and it would still create some uniformity within the neighborhood because there are a lot of, the pattern has been established, I think.
Well, I guess the bottom line here is that eventually, if a person asks for a variance, they've been getting them anyway, haven't they?
Right.
Yeah, see, so it's happening anyway. Here, you're giving them pre-approval for the variance, and you don't have
And
to go
saving
through
a lot of time.
Yeah, you don't have to go through all that
Right.
process. Yeah,
Have you
so-
been getting any negative feedback on the ones you've,
The variance,
yeah,
not that I know of.
I mean, I think that there are, from time to time, members of the public disagree with a variance request that a neighbor is applying for
At the public hearing.
at the public hearings.
But I
yeah.
don't know, unless you've heard it, I haven't heard complaints after the fact.
No,
You know, once the variance is granted, no one's complained to me.
no, and if it happens, it's very infrequent.
so, can I move to approve this? Is that?
Or just tell us,
standard?
actually, you don't even need to go there, just tell us you think we're going in the right direction. That's all I need to hear,
Yeah, seems right.
if you all agree.
well,
I'd
if-
like to hear what, I think, Ben, you mentioned at the beginning that there were pros and cons to the different options.
Yeah, so.
I'd like to hear more about the pros and
Again,
cons.
thank you, yeah, we talked about the idea of maybe creating a standard kind of linear buffer from the ordinary high water mark. Or if we were to go in and, pick each site on a set of parameters to determine whether or not that parcel would apply or not. Again, the purpose, if we focus on the Hayden Lake hillside area for a moment, the purpose is mainly because of the slope. It's not so much the parcel size that are the issue, it's mostly because of the slope. Most of these properties are pretty thin and they're steep and they just don't have room to kind of put the driveway and the structure. And
It's
so,
hard to even load a garage at the front of these things.
right. So they're
In the
just,
middle house.
yeah, so they're just confined because of the slope issues. Now, if that's the case, if it's primarily a slope issue, do we look at it based on just parcels that have those slope issues? Because not every parcel along Hayden Lake is the same.
Right.
Nor is every parcel along Hayden Lake the same size. So for instance, I mean, you have a lot of them that we have just been focusing on, but there is also this one too, that's also along the waterfront. It is 6 acres in size, Does it make sense to have that one be a part of this setback overlay district, being that they have 6 acres to kind of work with, rather than maybe a neighbor that has, a quarter of an acre? While there may be some slopes there, again, you could certainly argue that they have more room to be flexible.
No, that lot size is 6 acres, you couldn't subdivide that. Well, it's in the county, it's not in an incorporated area.
Actually, you could.
Could you subdivide? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you could still get it broken down like the other ones, I guess.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Okay, all right,
Yeah, so,
It could end up looking like the rest of the neighborhood.
yeah.
Right.
The only reason it hasn't is presumably the persons that have owned it.
But I
like
guess if you got a 6 acre lot, are you gonna put the house 10 feet from your neighbor and have the rest of the 6 acres out over here? So
That's Ben's question.
Yeah, yeah.
If you did the overlay, you could.
Yeah,
But if you leave it out, then the current zoning applies.
yeah, so I
That's
don't
why
know.
we need you to think
So
about
you
it.
just apply parameters of, light, maybe within a lot
Yes,
size.
and that would be how we would pick and choose what the overlay zone,
So you have a basic
does.
overlay, but you have parameters within that.
geographic parameters. We could carve the map of the overlay to fit these
Yeah,
kinds of things.
Yeah, you could.
and so, sorry, go ahead.
So what you're getting at, it sounds like, I understand it, I'm not sure I do, is that if you have a one-size-fits-all provision, you then would overly restrict people who, and really citizens who don't need that restriction.
Well, I mean, we're kind of loosening up the restrictions, I guess, by creating this overlay district. Because the setbacks are more confining at this point. And so if we go to this overlay district that allows them to be smaller, that means you're putting less of a burden, so to speak, on that particular property.
Right.
Now, is that necessary for a parcel of 6 acres, the one that we're just looking at? So, does that help?
How much trouble is it to do it on a more parcel-by-parcel basis?
It's certainly going to take more time than it would be to create a 500-foot buffer around the lake.
But we could just create the overlay zone to map out those kinds of areas, if that's your point.
Take out those areas.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
If I'm understanding the issue right between whether you do just one-size-fits-all or you do it more parcel-by-parcel, one-size-fits-all seems to be the definition, could be overly or under-restrictive depending on the slope. I assume the greater the slope, the more the setback, right?
It's actually the reverse.
Oh, it's the reverse, okay.
Because,
There you
because the slopes are so steep, it is harder to develop a property and meet that setback requirement.
Okay, all right.
They have to be so far back, that means their driveway and so on has to go into the hillside, and they're disturbing more of that property in order to comply with that 25%.
Got it, it's the reverse.
Yeah,
But
but
what I'm driving at, if it makes sense, is you want to restrict, you want to be least restrictive if you can,
Exactly.
and more targeted in your restrictions
That's the
to
idea.
accomplish the goal.
Yep.
Ben, if you zoom in to this area here, get rid of that.
Sorry.
Zoom into that again. But to me, what we're really getting at is we could create the overlay to leave this parcel out,
Yeah.
and catch all of this, or even just this, catch this, come back and leave this parcel out, and so on. So we can adjust the overlay just like the airport zone does today. That's one of the things we kind of need your feedback.
I guess why wouldn't we do that?
To me, we should, because it's.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't do it because you're penalizing the guy who has 6 acres when you do that. If the guy with 6 acres has the same slope as all the rest of the slope around him, why wouldn't he have the benefit of a relaxed?
For the reason Terry brought up.
Yeah,
His
but
$5 million home could be right there.
could
10
be,
feet
could
away
be,
from that.
could be, and we got to ask what kind of person that builds a $5 million home is going to want to build up to his
I can
neighbors.
show you examples in the county. But you have a valid point. There is no absolute right or wrong in this. We just need your thoughts about what's the best way to go forward.
I thought I
Well-
was absolutely right. You were absolutely wrong.
He could always come back and ask for a variance too.
A,
Oh,
B,
We want the least restrictive.
we may hear from him through the public hearing process.
Well, yeah,
Yeah. And we probably will anyway, regardless of which way we go. That's just planning.
So along those lines, the least restrictive, if it involves slope, but also size of parcel, then you bring those variables in to apply, because I agree with that, to apply the least restrictive rules that achieve what you want to achieve, right? And I guess my question is, how hard is it to do that, to gather that data?
Well, yeah, it's some of the data that we have is not perfect, and that's kind of the con side of looking at it as parcel specific. Is that if I look at, and I think this is the best data that we have as staff, is this slope layer that is based off USGS data. And that's
loosey-goosey.
Yeah, certainly not that detailed, and so.
You would know better than us.
So that is essentially what we're going off of if we use parcel specific in combination with slope.
What are the variables? Is it just slope or is it size of parcel?
Well, what we had talked about is looking at maybe just the parcel size and slope issues. But again, certainly willing to listen to some direction or some guidance from you as well. And we could certainly pursue other ideas.
And there can be other factors, like some of these areas have a private road running right through the middle of the lots and right next to the play.
Mm-hmm.
That creates another weirdness.
You know, I think this sounds to me like a good idea to turn these guys loose to come up with something that can be better managed and reduces the cost to not only the county but to the individual property owners. And it sounds to me like they've got some pretty good ideas. I kind of like the idea of the high watermark thing because you don't have to get tied up so much with getting really down to tight specifics. But then if you took a lot out like the 6-acre one, then you would have a specific for taking that one out of your overlay. But that sounds to me like it's a good idea. So I make a motion that we turn you guys loose on it. So.
Well, I will add maybe just for the point of the conversation, if we look at that option of, from the ordinary high water mark going a linear distance, we don't have good data to establish the ordinary high water mark.
Yeah.
So we are kind of using, or would have to use, a layer that kind of has been arbitrarily created by staff in our GIS department based on some aerial imagery about where the ordinary high water mark is. And so you'll see this kind of, if you follow my cursor here, this little blue line right here is kind of what staff has created based on that data. And so it's not perfectly the ordinary high water mark, but it's pretty close. And so if we do the linear distance, we'd have to pick it from somewhere because we just don't have the data to establish the ordinary high water mark.
Well, not only that, but with Corps of Engineers permitting, they say the normal high water mark, and again, it isn't an absolute. Coeur d'Alene Lake is 21, 28 because of the dam. We got a pretty good one there on Coeur d'Alene Lake.
Well, we have an elevation for Hayden Lake. We know that part.
All right.
But the problem is that if someone is requesting it, that maybe like if we pick a number like 500 feet from the ordinary high water mark, well, that's going to possibly apply and likely will apply to secondary type lots, or maybe even beyond that.
Well, whatever, I like the idea, but if it's going to be complicated, I'm not recommending that you do it that way. I'm just saying, let's turn you loose and you guys come up with the best approach to this.
Please explain why.
Yeah, and then explain why you came up with that particular approach or something, so.
Yeah.
Okay. What do the rest of you think?
I agree.
I'm not sure what's in front of us now, but I think we want to be less restrictive, right? At least at this end.
The methodology
Yes.
seems to me, it's the usual methodology I'd apply to this kind of situation. You look at what the end result is you're trying to obtain. It's water quality, right? And
That's part of it, yep.
Phosphates and stuff that are leaching into the water, and you're trying to mitigate that, right? And so then it seems to me you need to gather the data, high water mark, whatever data you need to establish, what the rule ought to be. And the least restrictive rule is generally the better. And if you can do it by parcel, it sounds like, and consider size or other data, you have a least restrictive means of achieving the goal. That just seems to me the logical progression of the analysis. And I'm wondering if you have enough data though, because it sounds like the data may be a little bit soft.
Yeah. It's certainly easier for staff if we apply something like a linear buffer, because there's always going to be those, if we look at other criteria, there's always going to be those that are like, well, why don't I apply, or why do they apply, and we just don't have the data, or we don't have, you know, all the information. So,
Well, point well taken. You don't not do anything simply because you can't. You might be lacking a little data here and there, and you know the problem that's occurring around it. You're causing harm by not doing it. So there is some give and take there. Where you just got to at some point maybe draw a line. But I'm just trying to figure out generally if you have the data to make it less arbitrary and more specific, and achieves the goal and has less restriction. That generally would be better. That's all.
But I do it now. You've confused me more. There's nothing. I don't see anything in here that addresses water quality concerns or issues. Right. This has the purpose is. Well, you know what the purpose is. It's right there in the first paragraph.
yeah, the water quality concerns would still be mitigated through our standard site disturbance regulations.
Yeah, there's nothing.
So there's nothing to be
changing.
changing with regards, other than we will still continue to, require
Right.
those standards.
Right.
But we don't want to sacrifice them either, I guess.
I admittedly have a tendency to confuse. However,
Well, Leander, you have a good point, and the rational basis for zoning is to protect health, welfare, and safety of
yeah,
the community. So the implied issue here is that among the things we look at for development is to protect the water quality of the land.
Yeah.
And ultimately setbacks have some effect on that.
yeah. I don't mean to overly highlight that, but I mean your purpose for what you're doing is a driving force, right?
Right.
To why you're making regulation and rules, and then you need to base it on rational data. That's all I'm really saying, and then try to be least restrictive rather than overly broad.
Right, and the easy takeaway here is we've had regulations in place since '73 that really didn't fit the need. And no one's ever dealt with it since then. So that's why we're trying to deal with it now.
Yeah, I think
I wonder.
I like the direction if you want.
You know the argument I've always had, we need more setback to protect like Coeur d'Alene Lake
Yes.
from fertilizing
Right.
lawns and stuff.
Yes.
The only thing is that these setbacks.
That could potentially be worrisome.
Well, I will mention
see,
though.
that's that's.
Sorry, yeah.
Because we, the two of us years ago went through a tremendous process of trying to get some larger setbacks on the bodies of water in Kootenai County because we were concerned about
Or at least
fertilization.
not lose what we had.
Yeah, or not lose what we had. Yeah.
But Ben,
So
but
it was
Ben,
quite a
but
process.
Ben just assured us that nothing changes in that regard.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the safeguards for that purpose are left unchanged.
Right, and I will mention that you'll see on the table there, it still continues to have a setback for waterfront lots. So the rear yard setback for waterfront is unchanged. So it's still a
Right,
25-foot setback from the waterfront. So that's unchanged with
And
what you see
the
there.
setback from the ordinary high water mark is still.
And the shoreline management area, which is also 25 foot in the slope distance,
Which
is
a different-
unchanged.
yeah.
That's a completely different section of the code.
Right.
Yeah,
So
that's
they still would have to comply with those
That would
setbacks
still
from
be-
the water.
Yeah, that would still be there. Okay. Yeah.
Go forward.
Yay.
Okay.
Anyone else?
Do you have any preference, whether we look at a linear buffer or parcel specific, or do you guys want us to?
I think whatever
So,
you
I'm in.
think would work
so your,
best.
your concern with parcel specific is people may feel they're treated unfairly because they're treated differently than the next parcel over.
Well, that may be vetted out through the public hearing process too. I mean, if they'll have opportunities to kind of address that one way or another, so that might be an opportunity for it to be resolved.
But I think because of what you do, you have a better, ground level view, you might say, of what's going on. So what will work best for the people who are coming and asking for the variances for that community. I would think you would have a better idea of which direction is better.
Okay, yeah, I mean, my personal preference is, I think, looking at it at parcel specific. I think that's, I think easier to justify rather than lumping all of the parcels around Hayden Lake to say that all the circumstances apply to each one of them. I think is a little bit of a stretch.
And parcel specific would be least restrictive, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah.
And
Not so
David, you
sure.
agree with that?
Yes,
Well, I was just talking to David, if they've got the data,
as good as it.
by a parcel, that's the best. I mean, that's the great,
It's not great data,
not
but
perfect,
it's a
yeah.
start.
Yeah, but it's some data, yeah, it
It's
isn't
a
just like
rational-
you've got a blank slate.
It's a rational base.
And it's rational to do it that way.
Yes.
Okay, fine. That
Yeah,
sounds good.
of course I disagree. But I think that ordinarily I don't like one size fits all, so I can talk out of my other side of my mouth now, but site specific is gonna raise questions, of unfair treatment, right?
People feel it, yeah,
Yeah.
I could see that.
And I guess you'll pursue it and see what happens, but if we go on a parcel by parcel basis, then my question is gonna be, okay, let's talk about the next subject. It has to do with what? Containers. And we're gonna wanna talk about a blanket, not an overlay, but a blanket zone, right? That treats everybody the same. So if on one hand we have parcel by parcel, then why can we not have parcel by parcel when it comes to other issues? You know what I'm saying? It strikes me as being inconsistent to go parcel by parcel. I'm not sure I'm opposed to parcel.
But you highlight the issue. I mean, you could have this feeling of unfairness,
Yeah,
where, it's least restrictive, but people are going to feel it. I totally get that.
But even if you take a linear distance, somebody who's just outside of that is going to have the same argument, right? They're going to say, well, I have even, steeper slopes than this person within that buffer. If they're in the buffer or that overlay district, because the reason is largely because of steep slopes, well, I have steeper slopes than they do. Why shouldn't I be part of that buffer or that setback overlay? So it's going to be either way you draw it, whether it's a linear foot or a parcel specific, there's going to be some haves and some have-nots.
true.
I think you would probably have a better argument to justify with a parcel specific.
I agree. That's what I believe, but again, it's certainly open to debate.
So
Yeah,
will
there's
you go on, I'm sorry, will you go on the angle of the slope then?
Yeah, so that would be the idea, is to say which slope or which parcels have these types of slopes, and to use that as part of the criteria.
But wouldn't you also have to base it on the ground that it is on, is it a rock slope or is it dirt and trees or what? Isn't
We
that all
don't
gonna
have
be
that kind of
covered?
data. As far as the actual geographical characteristics of each site, we don't have that kind of data. So you're right, there may be cases that are not that steep, but it's
But it's a rock.
entirely a rock outcropping, and there still is no room for development. While they may not be part of this overlay district, it doesn't necessarily excuse them or prohibit them from still pursuing a variance request. They can. So we probably won't catch everything, but this is attempting to curb some of those requests.
Reduce the need.
Yeah,
Well, and it can be changed,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
if it goes into play and we start having a lot of issues with maybe unfairness or they get mad, we can
We can always look at redoing.
correct. So it's not set in stone, right?
site by site basis. Just
Do we
curious.
need a motion, or do we just say, we want you to go ahead and
Go
come up
forward,
with
young
something?
man.
Yeah,
If
Go
most
west.
of you agree we're heading in the right direction, just tell us that.
Yes.
yes.
I think for maybe
Come
just
back
for
to
discussion
us.
purposes, having a little information for both the different perspectives, and I don't know if that's a burden that's not capable of being fulfilled with having the information come back for site specific versus the broad swath. As you guys get deeper into it, you might see
Sure.
some things come up, and
Yes.
I'd just be helpful.
We will,
Okay,
and we can touch base with you as we do.
great.
Great information, but I think there's just a lot more work to do.
Yeah, sorry,
Well, I
Ben.
think that's what
No,
they're
that's
asking.
why we're
That's
here,
what
is we're
they're
at the
asking.
beginning stages.
Yeah, staff understands that this is far from complete here, but we see the need for
Yeah.
something like this. We see it as being a benefit to the county and to the general public. So that's what we're here to do.
Okay.
We'll
We'll keep
revisit
working
this.
on it, we'll bring it back to you. Thanks for your help.
Yeah.
Who is taking cargo containers?
Ben,
So on this similar thought, I think you guys got a copy of this personal storage building and cargo containers amendment. Currently in the code, cargo containers and personal storage buildings for certain criteria need a special notice permit. A special notice permit is approximately just over $2,000. It is about a 3-month process. It's administrative, so David usually makes the call on these ones unless it's appealed or goes to the board, but typically they're before David. And so if somebody wants to put a cargo container on their property, the code currently requires them to go through the special notice process. Should they get approval, which essentially all of them do, because there's just a matter of performance standards that they have to comply with. If they meet those performance standards, then there isn't any reason why they shouldn't be granted an approval. Likewise, for personal storage buildings, if they meet the criteria, an approval is granted. So, keeping kind of in the same thought of how can we make this easier for the public, for the county in general, to save costs, to save time on their building requests, can we make these cargo containers and personal storage buildings more of a by right use, build in the performance standards rather than require this additional special notice permit process? So that's kind of the idea in a nutshell. Just for everybody's benefit, a personal storage building is kind of, as the title, it's a building meant for personal storage, but it is only those structures that are established before a primary use has been established. So this is like before you've established a residence, but you want to put a shop or something on your property. By code, those are called personal storage buildings. If you build that same structure after you have a house, it's called just a general accessory building. So there's a difference in terminology there. Just wanted to make some clarification. We're not talking about accessory buildings here. We're talking about specifically personal storage buildings.
So you're only talking about facilities that would be constructed before the residence was constructed on the property?
Yeah, or some other primary use within that
Okay.
particular.
You know, I have a question for you, and on the very first page of the stuff you sent out, under, it says C, primary uses listed in subsection A, but we never, you know, I don't have a copy of subsection A.
Yeah, so this draft is set up with, here are the proposed changes of the current code. And it's
Right.
only an excerpt of those changes. So I haven't included the entire code. We could go to those other sections if you like.
Well, the only point is that for me to be able to evaluate what changes you want when you reference a subsection that I don't have a copy of, then I can't, you know, and it's not.
Well,
it's
you
just-
actually do have it. When you first signed on, we gave you a copy of the land use development code.
Yeah,
You just have to
but
find that
I'd have to
section.
go, yeah. I guess
You'd
when
have
you
to
send
open the
something,
code.
yeah, when you send something out like this and you reference another section, it wouldn't hurt for you to just that one paragraph or whatever it is. So
Okay.
that's easier for us to
Okay.
review it. That's all I'm saying.
We'll plug it in underneath.
Yeah, so I mean,
We'll copy it.
because I'm lazy.
Can I ask a quick question though, Ben? Are there any differences in the requirements between a personal storage building and a general accessory?
Currently or as proposed?
Both.
Yes. I guess the answer is yes to both.
Okay.
So I don't know why I asked the question. I just want to make sure that it was clear what the
Yes.
question was.
Yes.
So yeah, there is differences both for personal storage buildings and accessory buildings. Right now with personal storage buildings, and I can actually go to that, it's actually in that draft that we're looking at now, but it's at the very end here. So here is the section 85202. This is the current code. This is what requires, again, a special notice permit. For personal storage buildings, these are the standards that they have to meet. So, things like C here, for example, the applicant shall demonstrate the feasibility of at least one primary use permitted or right. So what essentially happens is an applicant needs to go to the health district and get confirmation that they can still build a residence on the property, that's possible for them to mitigate their wastewater. The issue is the health district pretty much says it's possible no matter what property you're looking at.
With the exception of Bonanza Ranch.
Well, even with Bonanza Ranch, there are possibilities. I mean, they'll give you a list of things that you can do. You can find something on site, but for Bonanza Ranch, there isn't anything on site because they're all pretty small
So you're in
and
for
the soils don't perk.
$20,000 sewage system.
So they tell you that you can still do something on site, you can do something off site, so you have an easement and you pump it elsewhere to an approved drain field site, or you have some other alternative system like a compost toilet or incinerator toilets or something like that. So that is a letter that we, essentially a standard letter that we receive from PhD every time we ask this question. And so there really isn't any value to have them demonstrate.
It's checking a box.
It's checking a box, yeah. So we're like, well, let's just forget it. I mean, if all we're doing is trying to check a box here and it's possible and they just meet one of those standards anyways, there's no need for it.
So if somebody does build this building and they haven't checked that out because you haven't required it, that's their problem. I mean, if they could not meet the requirements and you haven't required it here, then that's their problem, that they haven't checked it out.
Yeah, they always can.
That's fine with me.
I guess. If they want to spend enough money to do it, there's always an option. You know, some of these incinerator toilets are always an option. You can always do that, except they are very expensive. And so very few people select that option. So, but it's possible. So yeah, these are the standards currently that are in place. Some of these standards will continue to remain as they're just general performance standards, but again, without requiring the special notice permit first. We'll just build it into the review process of the building permit. Going back to what Terry was bringing to light earlier, is there's still going to be a building permit process for these personal storage buildings. It's this, the review will go at the front counter side of things rather than going through a special notice permit process.
So if they wanted to put a cargo container out there, they'd have to get a permit, just like they would if they built a pole barn then, is that what you're saying?
Well, cargo containers are a little bit different for building code criteria.
Yeah.
They do not need a building permit. So cargo containers will not need a building permit unless you modify them in some way. Like if you're gonna add windows or add doors and things
You
like
want
that.
to live in it.
You want to live in it,
It's
certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it will need a building permit at that point, but in this case, again, they would just have the general performance standards that they have to comply with for a cargo container, as they would now, just again, without the requirement of a special notice permit.
So
Well,
that-
I guess the reason I'm asking these questions is, of course, I don't know how many of you people live in a rural subdivision, but I manage one as the HOA president and also the engineer responsible for the water system. And we're starting to get lots of cargo containers on 5-acre lots now. And most of them look like they're pretty good shape. But some of them must have just come off the railroad because they're all covered with graffiti and they look like the devil. So You know what I'm saying?
I do.
Yeah, so those I'm not too pleased with, as it diminishes the value of the properties in the subdivision because it looks like a junkyard, So I don't know that's my big question as far as cargo containers is concerned. I mean, I've got some folks, they look like they bought a brand new one, they look really good and everything. They're all fresh, they're painted the same color as the house even, so.
Isn't that something you deal with CCNRs? If you have a
Yeah, that's what I
development,
was,
then they can modify the CCNRs to prevent that, the graffiti container.
Well, my
Problem.
CCNRs say you can't even leave an unoperable car on your lot. They're pretty doggone tough, but you know who has to enforce them?
Yeah.
I have to, and that gets kind of tough sometimes,
It's the same
Well,
problem
was
we
there-
do, it's
Yeah.
just to a court.
Yeah, yeah, so.
But was there anything in the current code that prevented that? I mean,
Not for graffiti purposes.
Well,
Right.
there's a requirement for general screening, so
Yeah,
again, if
right,
we go back
right.
to,
but you're still keeping
And
that.
that would still be in place presumably.
yeah, so here's what is required currently, and this is essentially replaced in a different section, so that's why it's kind of entirely stricken out. So, first off, it says here not more than one cargo container is present for each 5 acres. For properties that are 5 acres or more, the cargo container is located at least 100 feet from all property lines, or it's located behind essentially screening. You have a 80% screen from view. If it's less than 5 acres, then you just need to be 80% screened from view. That's currently what the code says. A lot of these standards will still be applicable, again, mostly meant to remove procedure and just apply the standards.
So to meet these standards, you don't need a special notice.
Yeah. So
the special notice, is that, one of those signs that goes up and tells the neighbors?
It's like a baby CUP.
Right, so it just eliminates that.
It
You're-
eliminates process. So that it eliminates process, so you don't have to come in and pay money and go through a process, or we send out a notice and we make a determination.
And,
'Cause it's turned out to be fruitless, frankly,
But there's still the protection built in because.
because it's written into the code.
yeah.
I have another comment on the stuff that you sent out. The use of the term temporary or intermittent, but it's not defined, is
I
it?
hate that one.
Ooh.
No, we use Webster's, and we haven't actually gone to court on it because it's excruciatingly hard
Yeah.
to nail down intermittent use.
Can you define it in your code?
We could, we tried, the county commissioners didn't want to.
Oh, well, try it again.
Different county commissioners?
Well,
I got two of the same that turned it down
Well,
last time.
what I'm saying is that you have something in your code that's not defined. And
It's
so
defined by Webster's. Intermittent is defined by Webster's or the Oxford, that's where we start. But I give you, it's nearly impossible to enforce.
Oh, yeah.
Because people say, well, I'm sleeping here 2 nights a week in my RV, and then I'm gone for a week, prove otherwise. We have no way to prove otherwise, unless some neighbor's taking pictures every day.
Well, I've been able to do it because one guy in my subdivision put 3 travel trailers out there and he built structures around them.
Yeah,
And when he did that, of course, I took pictures of it and
right.
turned them into you guys. Yeah, but the other one, they built a trailer park out there with no septic service to it.
Oh, God.
And so I turned them, and somebody from the county put a stop to that because they were out there with their hoses coming out of the holding tanks onto the ground.
So back to the intermittent.
Yeah.
It's still intermittent for now.
and that's not something that we're addressing at all with this. You're talking about recreational vehicles, I think, is what you're.
That has nothing to do with containers
Oh,
or.
no.
Yeah.
But it has recreational vehicles in here, see, it says whatever it says here. Temporary intermittent recreational use of up to 2 recreational vehicles. subject to the standards set forth in the section. See, I'm telling you, people can't afford to live around here, so they got their family members living in travel trailers all over their property.
Believe me, we hear about it all the time.
Yeah, it's a real problem in the big subdivisions, the 5 acre, 10 acre parcels. Oh, yeah.
We have lots of code violations on those.
Yeah.
But again, we haven't actually gone to court and won yet because it's so hard to prove.
Well, I was able to do it.
Ben, on 8.4.304, under the cargo containers in the area you have highlighted in blue, B says located behind the principal building. Principal building, does that mean the primary residence, or does that mean a shop, or what does principal building mean?
Yeah, that's intended to be kind of the primary structure of the dwelling.
Okay.
It's typically a dwelling, but every once in a while it could potentially be another allowed primary use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Because there are,
Business or something.
sorry, go ahead.
sorry, 84304, is that what you said?
Yeah, and then B?
That pertains to agricultural, rural, agricultural, suburban, commercial
Right.
planning, so there is no residential zone anyway.
But residents are allowed in all those zoning districts.
Right.
Yeah, there
That's
are
typically
other,
the principal use.
yeah, there are
Okay.
other principal or primary uses within each of these zones outside of a residential use. And so if there was, for instance, if there were a farming, use that was established, general farming and forestry.
It could be a riding arena.
Yeah, or
Okay.
they have a storage structure that is maybe accessory to the general farming, but that is essentially the primary or the principal building,
Yeah, I
because there is
thought-
no other building.
Right.
Then the cargo container would essentially need to be behind that is kind of the idea.
Gotcha.
Yeah, we have some properties where somebody bought them years ago and they built a great big shop, heated, the whole thing, and they've never ever built a residence on it. But it's a real.
And that's why this
nice
language
building.
is in there,
Yeah,
just to deal with that.
yeah, and one of the other issues I have is I have some lots with no trees on it at all, out where it was farmland before, and then I've got other lots that are all timbered, and they're hiding their cargo containers back behind the house in the bushes or the trees. But those other folks, there's no place for them to hide their cargo container. Now, they put it behind the house, but it's out in the open where it used to be a cultivated field, those lots. So
Right.
there's a difference that you run into with
Well,
these
that's
things.
why we have and we're proposing to keep setbacks and screening and so on.
Yeah, both ways.
Just
both
make it
ways,
by
yeah.
right instead of.
Right, that's okay, because like I say, some folks.
Or we could
won't
look
have
at it on a parcel by parcel basis.
That would take a lot more
That's a
time.
little, that's kind of tongue in cheek, but I do want to, sorry,
No, okay.
for clarity on my part, like Terry, I looked for A and it wasn't there. So I looked for A over here and I find it, and then you talked about, you start with B on the handout, right? And you start with accessory uses number 5 and number 6. So that, I think what you're saying is that everything that's in here stays, and then you're starting with 5.
Exactly, yeah, I mean, and this is the way that it actually will look when it comes before you, like a public hearing, and also when the board, if it goes this far and they're ready to make an approval, should they do so, this is kind of the format it'll look before them. I guess it's the way that Pat has
It's
done
our
this. I don't know if that's
usual
universal or not,
process
but
for going to public hearings.
It just kind of slips into
yeah, exactly. This is only to show the areas that have been changed or proposed to change. Everything else remains the same.
Then one other point, if I may, is that somewhere in here I saw a couple of times, no outdoor storage. And I'm thinking that sounds a little
Yeah, what does that mean? I saw that as well.
onerous, but I don't know how you'd enforce that one either.
Well, that's been in the code since '73.
And
That's
how
right
does it
above
work?
the blue on here in number 5, no outdoor storage shall be permitted. Right above where he has the blue, number
So my
5.
understanding, right, that you're doing away with the requirement for a special notice permit, and you're focusing more on compliance with,
Building in the performance standards of the code rather than, eliminating the process.
so it streamlines the process a little and
And saves money.
gets the focus where it should be.
Yeah, exactly. Again, a lot of the things that you're bringing up, it's just already in the code. And it's not something that we're proposing to change. So, yeah, there are criteria with all properties about what kind of outside storage is possible. Outside storage that is in coordination or ancillary to like normal residential uses, like you got your boat, your RV and stuff like that. Those are traditionally things that are stored outside. But when we're talking about, excess of tires and things that are starting to border more of what could be considered, junk or whatever, there are other standards there.
That's supposed to be screened or inside a building.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of leads me to the question is, one who has never used a storage container, what is the social phenomena we're dealing with here? Are there more and more of these things out there?
I think they're just they're readily available, they're cheap to use for just some storage, covered storage.
So you're seeing a lot of them.
Yeah.
Oh, they're huge.
They are substantially cheaper than if you were to go to Lowe's or anybody else and trying to find like a shed. You can get 10, 20 times the amount of storage and actually pay significantly less. And they're
all
typically
steel.
waterproof and sealed. What?
They're all steel.
Yeah.
And
When I've seen plans where they incorporate them in a home.
Well, they
Comes to the
build,
driveway and then, yeah.
they build condos out of them,
Yeah.
actually.
And again, if they are looking to do something like that, then we're not talking about
Yeah, you build it
these
for
different
standards.
animal.
They are going to, if they're converted to like a residence, they're going to be a residence.
And it has to meet building.
Has to meet building code, and so on.
Well, I can see the appeal of that rather than paying every month to store your stuff, at one of these storage facilities that,
The answer to your question is yes. Things have changed. We have a lot more people and a lot more need for storage than we did 10 years ago.
right.
When I first started here 11 years ago, people complained about storage units all the time.
Well-
Now I never hear complaints.
Well, look at the Prairie. It's just turning into storage. Prairie Avenue, Hayden Avenue is just everywhere you go. There's a new storage unit going up. Just
Well, if you didn't allow that, then you're into your problem where you have tires and stuff all over the place out in the open, and nothing stored away.
Another issue is the preponderance of apartments, right? If you can't afford a house, you go to an apartment. If you have an apartment, you can't store anything.
but they can't even afford apartments.
That's another issue.
And then they live in the RV.
So David, you said there's cost savings. Is it not just cost
Process.
savings but it's cost savings to the city, the county?
Yes,
Because-
because it saves on staff time and it would unburden the staff so we can do other things.
So in the long run is what you're doing with this is you're saving staff time and basically money
Yes,
and the people time and money.
yes.
So they're coming in, it's a lot quicker, they get their permits, they're gonna get it anyhow.
And end up with the same result.
Same
Just
result,
faster,
but you're
cheaper.
saving time and money for everybody, is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good synopsis.
Sounds good to me.
Go
I mean-
forward.
Because there's obviously other things that people can be doing.
So this issue would come
Same
Before
thing
hearing.
as before, public hearing here at the board.
I think something like the personal storage building and the cargo containers, comparing it to the setback overlay zone, this is, I think, ready to go
This is something
forward.
we could gear up right now.
Yeah, for a public hearing, so I think that would be the next step, unless you guys have other questions about the personal storage building and cargo container.
Just define temporary. I keep telling you, it's in the Webster's dictionary.
So what you're saying, Ben, I think, is if somebody wants to move, are you asking for a motion that we?
Is that what you need?
I don't know if
We
that's.
don't
a
have
public
to, you can. This is just like before. You can give us direction, you can take a motion and a second vote. Doesn't matter.
It sounds to me like you got direction.
Anyone
Do you
disagree?
anticipate
But you
opposition?
said you're closer to having a hearing on this one.
We're ready to go, basically.
Yeah, I
It
think
needs a little
it's-
fine tuning.
All right, fine.
I think it's
Pat needs to
essentially,
look at it.
Yeah.
I think,
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
Pat will probably tweak things here and there, but I think the format is essentially ready to go. The question was brought up whether or not is there any opposition to something like this. I think the only opposition that we're likely to hear is for areas like Bonanza Ranch. And you guys may be familiar with Bonanza Ranch, maybe not. I'll pull it up here. We've
Fair
got.
to say it's unique in all the county.
But there's no water up there.
Keep hearing about this Bonanza Ranch. Maybe we need a separate part of the code, the Bonanza Ranch code.
I've talked to them about
Problem
overlay
child
zone.
code.
Yeah. So for just a quick, I guess some context behind Bonanza Ranch. Bonanza Ranch was platted in the 60s. They are roughly quarter-acre lots. But this was all before the county had land use standards, zoning standards. And so again, they were platted this way. The county adopted land use standards. It was identified as agricultural suburban zone and still is to this day. The problem with this area is that the soils prevent on-site sewage disposal systems. And so the health district has not been able to grant septic permits when somebody has requested a dwelling. There are some of them out here, largely because they were either one, before they had standards, and so are non-conforming, or
Three or four lots.
they have a total of 1 acre in size, and that gives, according to the health district, enough size for a septic system to be in place. So those are really the only options for residences. You have to have one of those kind of things. So what has happened is that property owners have not been able to build dwellings out here, and there has been limited use for them. This goes back to probably around 05 or so, when we did not have a personal storage. I'm probably getting a little bit in the weeds here, but we did not have a standard of personal storage building. The department were actually issuing these types of structures as accessory buildings when there weren't accessory to anything. And so we had been issuing these. We ended up being sued to say that you cannot issue these types of structures because they're not accessory. And so we actually required a property owner to tear down some. That prompted a change in our code to introduce the concept of personal storage buildings. So here we are, we have personal storage buildings. Now, at the time, the board was concerned about, specifically about Bonanza Ranch, that they didn't want this to be kind of an industrial park. They still wanted it to have, as it was intended to be platted, a residential neighborhood. Well, there's not many options here for this to be a residential neighborhood because of septic issues. And so that's kind of what, when we adopted this personal storage building standard, the board wanted still the ability for the applicant to demonstrate that it can still be used as a residence at one point. And that's where they decided, okay, we'll at least get confirmation from the health district that you can do it. Well, the health district, again, it answers with the same letter, so there really isn't any purpose to it. We've been issuing special notice permits for personal storage buildings out here, and you'll see, this area, for instance.
Yeah, look, they're not built, they're not dwellings.
They're not dwellings, they are personal storage buildings. At first, we had been getting a lot of opposition from property owners within the Bonanza Ranch area, mostly those that are residents in the area, saying that they don't want these buildings and they need to make the standards more robust or something so that they're not personal storage buildings anymore. Well, that would essentially make it a takings case, and essentially you have zero uses then for these properties. So we have received a number of comments from the public. We have implemented and are currently implementing a landscaping standard to at least put in some vegetation out there so that it mitigates some of the visual impact of these structures. And that's also still in the proposal too. It's actually we were using a standard that was a little bit nebulous, and staff was kind of looking at the general character of the area and saying, okay, well, what does the character of the area look like so that it fits or blends in with the character of the area? And instead of, using some arbitrary, well, 2 trees would be fine. We wanted to actually build the standard to say that, look, if you have a certain amount of length, then you just have to do these many trees. So it's kind of more easier to follow. So what kind of pushback would there be? There probably would be some pushback from some of the residents of Bonanza Ranch area to say that, look, at least we had the opportunity to submit written comments to express our concerns during the special notice permit process before the building permits were issued. Now, we would try and incorporate those standards the best we could, but again, we didn't deny any of these personal storage buildings. They were all
actually
approved.
appealed this.
I'm sorry?
And no one appealed this that I recall.
There's been an appeal, but they were, the decisions of the director were upheld, and so that's been long ago. And no one has really appealed for probably a decade.
Yeah, not since I've been.
I don't think so.
I have a question, and it's kind of outside of this a little bit, but there are dwellings on your aerial there. What are those people doing for sewage treatment? If a septic tank drain field won't work in that area?
Well, again, I'm not an expert.
I know you're not into that,
but
but I mean, there's some dwellings out there.
Some of these may predate code, because
Yeah.
the subdivision predates code.
Yep.
Yeah, but,
The answer to your question is,
yeah, well, now, code is one thing, but when you flush your toilet and it backs up and flows in the house because the drain field doesn't work, I mean, that's not code, that's a problem. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know,
a lot of these,
yeah.
maybe misconstruing, Terry, a lot of these buildings aren't homes. They're shops.
Most of them
Yeah.
are not homes. Yeah, I'd say.
Well, I can tell a shop from but it looked to me like there was a few homes on there. I just wondered,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, they're out there.
is there any idea of sewering the thing?
No,
Oh.
that would cost a fortune, and the county and none of them are willing to put up that fortune.
Oh, yeah.
And you got to remember, the starting point is this is divided in 6.3. It should never have happened then, but it did.
Yeah.
And you can't unchisel this stuff.
Yeah, I was here then, yeah.
So people have some expectation that there ought to be something they can do besides just camping. And so far, that's ended up being storage, either containers or actual bona fide stick built.
Pole barns or something, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's RV places actually up there for
Yeah,
sale.
that's another
We have
common
for
use
sale.
for some of these
one of our
properties.
largest number of code enforcement issues is this area.
Oh, yeah, I don't know that.
We got probably 30 of them.
Really.
But anyway, back to the point, that's the pushback.
That was meant to, sorry to get into
Oh.
the history of that, but I don't know if that helps.
So where we're at, is you think you want to have a hearing on this?
I think we're ready for it, but
After Pat reviews it,
And we don't need a motion.
you don't, unless you have objections or something you want to change right now.
Don't really have an objection.
So you
I mean,
guys will come
sounds-
back to us with the final product
Yes.
then? Yeah, okay.
Right.
Before we have a hearing on it, yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Just because I'd like for Pat to give it to once over.
Yeah, Pat had seen
let's,
it,
yeah, we'd like to have the draft available for not only you, but for the public too, so that they have an opportunity to review it.
Right. Okay?
Is there any further business for this afternoon? And we are adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
We're gonna have that
Yes.
6 hour thing next week, are we?
Oh, yeah.